Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Welcome to a special event, June Eyre, where during the month of June, we're going to be celebrating my very favorite book, Charlotte Bronte's 1847 novel, Jane Eyre, a novel about a young woman who is plain and little, but also independent and bold and intensely committed to her own autonomy. We first meet her as she is going through a harsh childhood, and we watch her go through lots of very exciting complexities as she grapples with how to control her passionate nature, what it means to love other people, how she can express her religious faith and spirituality, and how she can live a life of dignity as the equal of others in human society. I first read Jane Eyre when I was, I think, 11 years old. Without any guidance, I plucked it off a shelf of my mother's old teaching books, not knowing anything about it. I think it might have been my first adult book, although it's quite accessible to young people, including those with no one telling them what the main themes are or what to look for. In other words, this video I'm making right now is totally unnecessary. But back to my experiences with this novel. I think I've read it almost every year since I discovered it. For a long time, I would pick it up, start at the first page, and finish on the last page. About a decade ago, when my life got a lot more complicated, I turned to Jane Eyre almost as therapy, a way to keep me calm and grounded in the face sometimes of personal or familial illnesses, etc., but also at times, like when the pandemic started, or as I grapple with the stress of politics, perhaps especially intense here in DC, where I live. So now I often just read passages here and there, sections I especially love, or ones that are on my mind for some reason. One of my print editions of Jane Eyre more or less lives right beside my bed. And of course, a digital version on my e-reader goes with me almost all the time in my backpack or purse. But I'm certainly not the only airhead here on BookTube. Joining me in my celebration of Jane Eyre this month is Steve Donoghue, who is going to do one of his amazing read-alouds of the entire novel, complete with his asides and off-the-cuff commentary made as he reads. If you haven't experienced one of his read-alouds, you're in for a real treat. And I hope all of you will play along with us. Over here on this channel, I'm going to talk in some detail about the larger thematic issues in videos that will cover not each individual chapter, but the main sections of the novel. For example, my first substantive video in this series will be in a few days, covering the first 4 chapters of Jane Eyre, I think. The chapters about Jane's childhood living with her aunt's family at Gateshead Hall. Several days later, I plan to make a video about chapters 5 through 10, discussing Jane's experience at the Lowood School. My plan is to post these roughly when Steve finishes reading those chapters aloud. While I assume many of you have already read Bronte's novel, and may even have read it dozens of times, I also assume that some of you have not read it before, and I promise that as we go along, I won't be sharing any major details about plot points past the chapters we're discussing in that video, so newbies can watch the story unfold in all its dramatic and sometimes wildly unexpected ways. One of the most interesting things to me about Bronte's novel is that while Jane Eyre repays reading over and over again throughout our lives as we mature and change, at the same time, the novel is really something of a thriller that can leave new readers turning pages late into the night just to find out what's going to happen next, or perhaps instead why something already happened that we don't yet fully understand. So I said Jane Eyre is something of a thriller, and it is, but at the same time, this is still a Victorian novel. And while it breaks all sorts of new ground in some ways, it also follows a fair number of traditional 19th century literary conventions. And we'll talk about that a bit along and along. What I find really interesting is that the combination of convention And radical independence from convention is part of Jane's personality, too. She always is expressing a mix of her own desire for independence and autonomy and passion with the more expected conventions of 19th century England. Today I want to give you just a little bit of background material, as well as talking briefly about some of the big themes we might see and some questions we might ask ourselves as we read the following chapters. Let's start with a little bit of background about the first publication of the novel back in 1847. Here's the original title page. There are a few things that might stand out to you. First, it doesn't list Charlotte Bronte as the author. Charlotte and her sisters Emily and Anne Bronte all published their first novels during the same year, 1847, using pseudonyms. Using the initials that started their names, Charlotte Bronte was Currer Bell, Emily became Ellis Bell, and Anne went by Acton Bell. The implication was that the three authors were related, and it suggested that the authors were men, although the names are fairly ambiguous. To some degree, the authors were almost certainly trying to avoid gender-based condemnation as, quote, scribbling ladies or whatever. As Charlotte said, more or less, I wish people would judge me as an author, not just as a woman. But the sisters might also just have been trying to protect their privacy. They were even keeping their identity secret even from their brother and father. And their personal privacy could even affect the writing. Charlotte, for example, said that the idea of using a pseudonym gave her the daring to write the plain truth. Publishing under pseudonyms was quite common at the time. Many readers would have basically assumed that these strange names were invented. If anything, using pseudonyms invited intense speculation about the identity of the authors. There was immediately debate in the literary world about who the authors were and whether the authors were men or women. And was it possible that all three books were written by only one author? So while their use of Currer, Ellis, and Acton protected their personal privacy and left their gender a debated question, instead of blunting the conversation about who the authors were, it actually intensified that conversation. And I suspect the Brontes knew it would do exactly that when they chose to use pseudonyms. Interestingly, while Charlotte Bronte was not initially listed as the author, neither was Currer Bell. Instead, Currer was listed as the editor. The subtitle of Jane Eyre claimed that the novel was an autobiography. From what we know about word usage at the time, an autobiography didn't necessarily mean something as definitive as it means now. It didn't have to imply that it was the story of a real person's life told by that person. Instead, the subtitle announced that the novel was a personal narrative written in the first person, similar to other works already in publication that were not autobiographies by today's standards, from Robinson Crusoe to Tom Jones, who used the same kind of conceit. In other words, readers would not have assumed that Jane Eyre was a real person who had written her own story only to be edited by Currer Bell. Those readers would have recognized this was a conceit, and when they read that Bell was the editor, they would have known that it was a joke. Most would have thought that the author actually wrote the whole thing, whether Jane Eyre's story might possibly have been inspired by a true story or whether it was just entirely fictional. So that is two of the odd things. The third is that the novel was published in 3 volumes. That was common during the 19th century and didn't imply that the book was a trilogy, although novels of this era were often structured with natural breakpoints that would fall between the volumes. You can see the echoes of books published in the trilogy form in some modern editions, where the chapters of each section, or so-called book, are now all published together in one volume, but the chapter numbers restart during each section. Other versions of the texts don't do that. They renumber everything, which makes the books a little bit easier to use in classrooms, etc. Why would presses publish 3 separate volumes to contain one novel? When the first volume appeared, it could drum up interest for the other volumes in the novel. That's one reason books published this way sometimes have something of a cliffhanger type ending to the first 2 volumes. And then, during the Victorian period, many readers read from circulating libraries. And when one reader finished the first volume and exchanged it for the second, another reader could immediately acquire that first volume without having to wait for reader 1 to finish the entire novel. As you might guess, 3-volume novels tended to be on the longer side, as is Jane Eyre. So to a degree, the popularity of the 3-volume novel encouraged a certain kind of form and length for Victorian novels. Still, a few 19th century novels were published in 4 volumes, and others were only 2, like Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. In addition to being too short for 3 volumes, the plot line of Wuthering Heights very specifically fits the 2-volume structure, with its clear storyline division between the 2 halves, suggesting that when Emily wrote her novel, she was quite aware of how her novel would be published. And interestingly, Emily's book was published alongside the 1-volume Agnes Grey by Sister Anne, creating a 3-volume set. Important here is that it was typical for 3-volume novels to all be released at the same time. These were not serialized novels, like much of Dickens' work was, released in little bits in the penny press along and along before eventually being released in full book form. This style of publishing shaped the narratives too, making the cliffhangers or natural breaks come much more frequently. But despite the fact that Jane Eyre was not published serially, we're more or less going to be reading it that way for this series of videos. We'll be breaking things up not by volumes, but instead by episodes. When I was thinking about how to break the book up for these videos, I realized that it's fairly easy to break into relatively equal portions based on natural breaks in the basic plot points. And that made me wonder if Charlotte Bronte was considering the idea that her novel might be released serially, even though things didn't go that way. I should look that up. Let's talk for a moment about the genre of the novel. Perhaps the most obvious genre here is the Bildungsroman, the story of growing up and maturing, of building oneself. We meet Jane when she is a young orphan, living with her aunt's family in an abusive situation. She then receives an education, works as a teacher, and then hires herself out as a governess to the young ward of the wealthy owner of Thornfield Hall. That carries us through the first set of chapters, and I think we'll just leave it there. Another genre Jane Eyre might fit into is the Gothic novel. If you know about the Twilight series, you'll see some similarities here. But despite a lot of Gothic elements, this novel is, at least in general, also a book of realism, which in some ways is opposed to the Gothic novel. I find Bronte's combination of these effects to be extremely effective, and I hope you will too. On top of that, this book also fits into the genre of spiritual narrative, the story of how Jane embraces and sometimes resists particular kinds of religious belief and practice. While her faith is deeply rooted in Protestant Christianity, it's also deeply personal and spiritual. She calls out religious hypocrisy wherever she sees it. What she learns to embrace over the course of the novel is self-control over her passionate nature, while still embracing that passionate side of herself. I want to finish up by mentioning a few things you might keep an eye out as you read. And here I mean symbols and other recurring motifs. I'm certainly not going to name all the symbolism you'll soon be spotting, but here are a few things to pay attention to. First, fire, in all its guises, from candles to lightning, recurs over and over throughout the novel. I would argue that this symbol doesn't have a static meaning in this book, just as it doesn't in real life. Sometimes fire provides warmth and light. Sometimes it indicates passion, But passion has a lot of meanings. The passion of erotic energy, as well as the passion of rage. And then, of course, fire can symbolize destruction. Ice and cold also appear quite often. Why? Actually, there's a lot of discussion of landscape and weather, imagery that gives us a moody or atmospheric sense of what Jane is feeling. And then there are also a lot of mirrors in this book. Starting in the first section, we'll discuss what do you make of their presence. We'll be talking more about that a bit later. Also, birds, again, starting in the very first sections, but appearing again and again throughout the book. How do you think the frequent reference to birds works in the novel? And how about the presence of substitute mothers, starting in the first 4 chapters with 2 competing images of substitute mothers? How many other symbols can you find as you read along? A few more. Keep your eyes open for cliffs and precipices. They usually mark moments where Jane faces a really big change, not necessarily a dangerous one, just a reorganization of her world in some way. And also notice the frequent references to the moon and to moonlight, which also often symbolizes coming change. Some other ideas that appear in this book. The Bronte sisters were writing at a time when industrialization was changing British society, and there are a few interesting comments about that in Jane Eyre. See if you can find them. Charlotte is also grappling with issues of justice, sometimes about very specific interpersonal behaviors, and sometimes about the various kinds of inequality she saw around her. As we go through the text, we'll talk more about what she means by equality. There are also abundant references to slavery in this book, some stated explicitly and some only alluded to. Slavery was a huge issue discussed broadly in England at the time, mostly because of the American system of chattel slavery. Sometimes Bronte is talking directly about chattel slavery, and sometimes she's using slavery as a metaphor about the expression of power more broadly. These references are relevant to a couple of the plot points later in the book, which we'll talk about later. Let's look at a couple of big themes to keep your eye on. One that I think Jane herself would name is her search for a true home. Then comes the theme of balancing passion and self-control, which I already mentioned. Yet another is religion. Jane is committed to a certain kind of religious thought rooted in Protestant Christianity, as I said, but she pulls more closely to the personal than to the formal church. And forgiveness is, not surprisingly, a key part of her spiritual growth. And we'll see Jane talking about the difficulty of true forgiveness starting in the very first section. Before I sign off, let's consider the narration of the book. As I said at the beginning, the book is written in the first person, but with little exception, what we see is not immediate commentary about what is going on. In the first chapters, we'll read Jane, the character, is 10 years old, living through some pretty hard times. But we don't get an unfiltered view of what she thinks about what is happening. Instead, we hear from Jane, the narrator, who was an adult woman at a totally different point in her life, looking back on these events and trying to make sense of not just what literally happened, but about how she responded to those situations at the time, as well as how she grew from those experiences. And so what we get is an amazing amount of Jane's interiority. That is, what's going on in her head, sometimes early in her life and sometimes as an adult woman looking back. If you've read a lot of Victorian fiction, interiority is not usually a big thing. We see much more of it towards the end of the 19th century, getting more and more complex into the early 20th century as modernism came into its full glory. But Charlotte Bronte is one of the authors who started the development of that approach in some ways. In addition, Bronte is talking directly to us, to the readers, and that leads to what often feels like a very intimate book, even when the plot is at its most exciting. All right, I'm looking forward to listening to Steve's reading of Jane Eyre and to sharing some of my own responses to the novel as we go along. And I hope you'll join us. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.